Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Half Pint session. We're kicking off the first Half Pint session of this season with actually a little bit of a callback to Out of the Silent Planet. I get quite a lot of publishers inviting me to interview the authors that they're publishing, and to be fair, a lot of them, it's not particularly relevant, or I'm just not particularly interested. But the guest that I'm going to interview today in his book hit both of those perfectly, because it's a really interesting story, very funny history, although it's not always meant to be. And it's also directly related to Lewis, if you know the background that he was working within. Today, I'm speaking with David Barron, and he is the author of The Martians. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David.
Would you mind just introducing yourself a little bit? Tell us a little bit about your career, and also how you came involved in musical theatre. I found that out recently. Go for it.
Well, so I've been a science writer, science journalist my whole career. For many years, I worked in public radio. I was a science correspondent for NPR back in the late 80s and 90s, became a science editor in public radio. I've since transitioned into writing books. So The Martians, which we're going to talk about today, is my third book. And my idea about writing books is, even though I'm a science writer, I want to write stories that are just so compelling that it doesn't matter if you're interested in science or not. They're just good human tales. And so my first book was called The Beast in the Garden. It's broadly about the growing conflict between people and large predators in the United States, but it is specifically the story of the Colorado's first fatal mountain lion attack, an 18-year-old who was killed and eaten behind his high school back in 1991, and what led to that and the lessons from it. My second book, which came out in 2017, was called American Eclipse, and this gets to the musical theater. It's the true story of a total solar eclipse that crossed America's Wild West in 1878 and helped inspire America's rise as a scientific power. Many great names, including Thomas Edison, were out in the Wild West in 1878. And so then that comes to my third book, The Martians, and during which time, when I was writing it, I actually served the best title in the world. I was the chair in astrobiology for the Library of Congress. It's sort of like a fellowship for people who are doing scholarly research in life in outer space. But getting to musical theater, so my book, American Eclipse, which again came out in 2017, has been turned into a musical that hopefully is headed to Broadway. It's a wonderful piece. It has yet to be premiered publicly, but I've seen several workshop productions. The composer-lyricist is named Michael John LaChiusa. He's got a couple of Tony nominations. He's just a wonderful, wonderful composer. And if all goes well, it'll be on Broadway in 2027.
That's so exciting. Just of all the topics that I thought would get turned into a musical, that's not it.
Oh, exactly. It was not something that I imagined would be coming out of it. I actually think The Martians would make a better musical, but American Eclipse is a terrific musical.
Well, let's talk about The Martians. And when did the first real craze for The Martians and this particular interest in Mars begin?
Well, so the period I write about is the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it all started in Italy with an astronomer named Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was quite a well-renowned astronomer who decided he was going to make a map of Mars. And so in 1877, when Mars made an especially close approach to Earth, he, night after night, studied the planet and made a map of it. And there were dark areas and light areas that looked like oceans and continents. Mars seemed very Earth-like. But Schiaparelli noted as well a network of fine lines, very straight, almost artificial looking. And he imagined that they were waterways of some sort. And he called them canali, which in Italian means channels. And it was promptly mistranslated into English as canals. Now, early on, people knew that that was a mistranslation, but still that was the word that stuck. But later on, an astronomer came along named Percival Lowell, who actually believed they were canals, not for shipping, but for irrigation. And it was Percival Lowell who really pushed this idea. He's the main character in my book, that Mars, if it had canals, artificial waterways, it must have intelligent life. And that's what really sparked the idea that Mars was home to an intelligent civilization.
And as I was going through your book, that name, Giovanni Schiaparelli, it rang a bell, and I remembered. I went and looked in my notes for Perelandra. Lewis talks about him there because in Perelangia it's mentioned that this astronomer thinks that one side of Venus is always dark, one side is always light, just because of the nature of the orbits between the Earth and Venus. So it was funny to find him mentioned there. And then as soon as I read about these canals, I remembered what we did in our research for Out of the Silent Planet, that yes, this was a prevailing theory at the time. And in Lewis's book, he invents this language, Old Solar, and he speaks about the Handramit, literally the low Earth. And that's where all of the life is. It's not up in the Harandra, it's not up in the plateaus, it's down low. And it was really great to read your book and have all of that filled out, that people were thinking, it's like, oh, this sort of makes sense. This is probably a very old world. You've got these polar ice caps and not a whole lot of water anywhere else. So this advanced civilization is going to be funneling all of the water down to the lower land so people can survive.
Right. And the Handramits were artificial. I mean, they were constructed by the beings on Mars so they could survive as the planet was dying. And that was precisely what Percival Lowell said was going on Mars. So yeah, so C.S. Lewis, his Malacandra comes directly out of Lowell's Mars.
And Lewis himself, he wrote many essays, quite a few, I think three essays, and you got a couple of books out of it, about the impact of space travel on religion, in terms of, well, what do we do if we're going to space and we don't see God? And so he writes the Seeing Eye in response to it, when the Russian cosmonauts go into space and don't see God. And he also writes in Religion and Rocketry. Well, okay, what if we did discover another alien species? What does that mean specifically for Christianity? And in your book, you speak about some of the religious impact that this Mars craze had, and particularly in reference to Flammarion, a Frenchman who's one of your other supporting characters in the story. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about Flammarion and what his views were?
Right. So Camille Flammarion was he was an astronomer, a French astronomer. He was also a science fiction writer. He was just sort of a public intellectual. And he had just a really ardent following of fans. He was a best-selling writer. I mean, he was sort of, I'm dating myself a little bit, but sort of like the Carl Sagan of his time, that he was both a serious scientist, but also someone who inspired a sense of spirituality and awe about the universe. And Flammarion believed that Mars was inhabited. He saw the canals on Mars, as did Schiaparelli. He was a friend of Percival Lowell's. And he had a theory, and it was not just him, that perhaps the Martians and aliens on other planets were actually the souls of dead humans. That when humans died, our souls went to other planets and lived again. And again, that actually predates Flammarion, but he actually, I mean, at times, I think he believed that was possible. I don't know that he knew that was a fact, but that comes up in some of his fiction writing. But getting back to religion, I mean, that was one of the things I found most fascinating. So writing this history book about this bizarre era, when you could open the New York Times and read about the civilization on Mars in all seriousness. Alexander Graham Bell was convinced. I mean, great scientists were convinced that this theory was true, and I wondered, well, what would the impact be on religion? In fact, you had some atheists at the time who said, "Aha! If there really are aliens on Mars, well, that shows that the Bible can't be true. What does it mean for Adam and Eve and creation? And could Jesus have come to Earth? For us, did all the other planets have original sin?" And yet, religious leaders found a way to incorporate this idea of Martians into their religious beliefs. By 1908, you had pastors sermonizing about the Martians. In fact, saying that the Martians were role models for us, that they were more moral than us, more peaceful than us, and we should look to them as a civilization to emulate. So that was fascinating to see the way science and religion came together.
And it is quite amazing how everyone's imaginations just sort of got ahead of them. And I'm not blaming him, but one of the other people that you speak about is H.G. Wells. And Lewis writes Out of the Silent Planet in large part in homage to and in response to H.G. Wells. He loved his writing, didn't agree with his worldview, and so wanted to take some of Wells's stories and sort of turn them on their head and reimagine what might be. But where does Wells fit into the popularizing of tropes and concepts and just the enthusiasm behind what life on Mars might mean?
Well, certainly the most famous piece of fiction to come out of the period I write about, this Mars craze of the 1890s and the first part of the 1900s, was The War of the Worlds, which was, many people know it better for the Orson Welles radio version in
Hmm.
1938, but it started out as a novel written by H.G. Wells in 1897. And H.G. Wells was trained in science, but then he became an author. And of course, he's known as one of the fathers of science fiction. And the War of the Worlds came out of the ideas of Mars at that time. In fact, so I write about in my book that in 1892 and again in 1894, when Mars made an especially close approach to Earth. So every 26 months, Mars and Earth come close together. And in 1892 and 1894, at these times, there were these bright lights seen on the very rim of Mars. And some people were speculating that these were the Martians signaling to Earth. Probably what astronomers were seeing was sunlight reflected off high clouds. But that actually shows up in the War of the Worlds. H.G. Wells writes about these strange lights seen on the rim of Mars, which in his book, in retrospect, must have been the casting of the great gun that the Martians were creating in order to fire their rockets at Earth. And the Martians themselves, in the War of the Worlds, for those who may remember, they marched across the Earth in these giant tripods that were killing humans. But the Martians themselves, inside those machines, were these hideous monsters. They were basically like octopuses or jellyfish, just a giant sack of flesh with a brain, with these tentacles coming out. And that actually came out of the idea that Mars is an older planet than Earth, that presumably life had originated there before Earth, life became intelligent there before Earth. And so the idea was, well, the Martians of today are what we humans will be in the distant future. And so Wells did that thought experiment, and he thought, well, if we're becoming more and more reliant on our brains and less reliant on our physical being, we have machines to do the heavy lifting, then eventually we're just going to become brains with tentacles to control our machines, which is what the Martians were. So that's where his idea for the War of the Worlds came from. But I should say, H.G. Wells very interestingly revisited Mars a decade later, after he had actually met with Percival Lowell and was now convinced by Lowell about Lowell's ideas about Mars. And by then, H.G. Wells had a very different idea about the Martians. They now were more humanoid. They're depicted in this wonderful magazine article in the Cosmopolitan magazine that H.G. Wells wrote. They look sort of like angels. They've got wings, and they're tall and skinny with big eyes. You can see them together with their families. They're not these monstrous beings, but now they're really angelic.
Hmm. And the height, the tallness, I believe you said it was related to the question of the gravity, which is another thing that you find in Out of the Silent Planet with the Sorns and everything sort of just seems impossibly tall on Malacandra.
Right. I think they were described as madly elongated. And that's right. Yeah, because since Mars is a smaller planet and has a lower force of gravity, presumably beings could grow taller and tall and skinny without, the mass of all that body weight pulling down on the bones and muscle. They could grow taller with the same amount of musculature.
And one of the things that's amazing about this is just how big a craze it became. And you've mentioned him a few times now, so I'd just like you, if you wouldn't mind filling out his story a little bit. Percival Lowell, where did he fit into all of this, and why was he so influential in shaping this view of Mars and people's hopes that they then attached to it?
Yeah, so Percival Lowell came from one of the most storied families in New England, the Lowells of Massachusetts, who made their fortune early in the Industrial Revolution. The city of Lowell, Massachusetts is named after the family. And so Percival Lowell was born to great wealth. And when he graduated from Harvard, as all the men did in the Lowell family, in 1876, he could have done anything with his life. He decided first to become a kind of a roving anthropologist. He spent a lot of time in the Far East, in Japan and in Korea. He wrote books about Asian culture. He was fascinated by things that were exotic. And later on, when he turned getting close to 40, he actually read a book by Camille Flammarion, the French astronomer, about Mars, suggesting that Mars was inhabited. Well, what could be more exotic than beings on another planet? And so Lowell decided to dedicate his life and his fortune to studying the possibility of life on Mars. He created a private observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's still there. The Lowell Observatory bought one of the best telescopes of the time and started studying Mars night after night. And he saw the canals like Schiaparelli did. He saw, in fact, even more of them. He came up with this theory that they were irrigation canals. And Lowell, being intelligent, a very good writer, a very persuasive speaker, he went out on the hustings to promote his idea. And at first, it was seen as a very interesting theory, but within a decade, it was almost seen as proven.
How did the tide, though, start to change? Because you had people seeing what they thought were canals, and everybody getting whipped up about it, and even reputable scientists confirming, mainstream media writing that this is established science fact at this point. How do things then start to change?
Well, so it went back and forth. So first, I'll say Lowell had some help from others, particularly the inventor Nikola Tesla, who's a fascinating character, and I enjoyed writing about him in my book. But Tesla was a genius, and he is responsible for the modern system of electrical power generation and distribution that we have today. Mm-hmm. And so by the late 1890s, he was a celebrity, he was wealthy, he was always in the newspapers. And having first done research on the distribution of power by wires, he got interested in the idea of the wireless transmission of electricity. And that included what we now call radio, but radio didn't yet exist. Marconi was also just starting to work on this at the time. Well, so Tesla came out to Colorado, where I live, from New York in 1899, set up an experimental laboratory to study how radio waves are propagated through the atmosphere. And he would listen for natural sources of radio. There were no radio stations at that time, but you could listen to, for instance, distant lightning. You could hear the clicks and pops on a radio receiver. Well, one night he was alone in his laboratory, and he started to hear this very faint, bizarre signal. It was coming in these triplets. It was just a faint click, 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 over and over again. And he couldn't think of any natural explanation on Earth for it. And so Tesla became convinced that this was the Martians, Lowell's Martians, trying to communicate with Earth. So when Tesla announced this to the press, that just accelerated this craze about Mars. And it took over society. The Martians ended up in Broadway plays and Tin Pan Alley songs and in the comics and newspapers and in advertising. But still, it was considered an interesting idea. No one really knew if Tesla had picked up radio signals from Mars. Lowell then was able to start taking photographs of Mars that he claimed proved the existence of the canals. And for a while, people were kind of convinced, although these were the tiniest of photos. They were a quarter inch across, which at the time was considered remarkable with photographic technology back then. But all along, there was a question about, were these lines on Mars real? Because you're looking at a planet that's 35 million miles away or farther away, depending on where it is in its orbit, through a telescope. They have to look through the Earth's atmosphere, which distorts things. And so you're looking at the surface of a planet that's just at the very limit of perception. It was hard to make out what was there. And so the question was the eye being tricked? We all know about optical illusions. I mean, people will show you something and you swear that one square is darker than the other, or the lines are not, they can't possibly be parallel, or, two colors are different. But actually, the eye can be fooled very easily. And so the theory was that, in fact, Mars has all sorts of interesting shapes and colors, and there's stippling and shading. And if you're looking at something that's very hard to make out the details of, that the eye will naturally look for, line things up and see patterns where there are none. And if you add to that the great desire of someone like Percival Lowell to prove his theory, Once you believe there are lines there, you're going to see them in profusion. But so that was the counter argument for a while, but it was hard to really bring Lowell down because he studied Mars more assiduously than anyone. So
As
how
anyone
could
that's
it?
ever spoken to a flat earther will know, it's actually really kind of difficult debating them because you're
Yeah,
often talking to somebody who has studied a lot of things in great depth.
yeah. Well, and Lowell, as smart as he was, would always have a counter argument.
Mm-hmm.
But what eventually took him down was another astronomer who had previously seen the canals, who had believed that they were there, but then was able to, on one just remarkably clear night when Mars made a very close approach to Earth in 1909, looking through the largest telescope in Europe, this astronomer named Eugene Michel Antoniadi, they vanished where he knew where the lines were supposed to be. But when he had a really good view, the lines disappeared and they were just natural shapes. And so Antoniadi took it upon himself to really take down Lowell, and he did a pretty good job of it. Lowell, so that happened by 1910. Lowell never gave in. Lowell remained adamant that that the lines were there, that they were canals, that the Martian civilization existed. He portrayed himself as a persecuted genius up to the moment he died in 1916. And in fact, he had made had a great influence on the world, not the way he intended in terms of science, but in terms of imagination. Lowell's Mars really did help launch science fiction in the 20th century, and it really helped launch the space age too, because it was early. It was the kids who grew up in that Mars craze, some of them who became the early rocket scientists who would figure out how to get us to outer space.
So if we ever strand Matt Damon on Mars, Lowell might actually be to blame.
Exactly.
I did find it funny when I was reading a book when I read the Tesla story, because in Out of the Silent Planet, Earth is the silent planet, which means there's no communication between the planets. And here was Tesla listening to what he thought was signals coming from Mars. And that idea, you see it pop up again and again in science fiction movies like Contact or Independence Day. And it's like there's this repeated message. What does it mean? Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's a countdown to the destruction of the White House. But I did find it amazing. You mention in your book about even the US military trying to help contact with Mars. Would you mind explaining what happened there?
Right. So again, it was 1899 that Tesla thought he picked up radio signals. And then there was Tesla wanted to send radio signals back. And he had this whole grand scheme that unfortunately he was never able to raise the money to make happen. Not that he would have succeeded, of course, because the Martians weren't there. But there still was the idea that the Martians might be trying to reach us by radio. And so Mars and Earth come close together every 26 months. But the orbit of Mars is more elliptical than circular. And that means that sometimes when Mars and Earth come close together, they come especially close. And that's about once every 15 years. And so in 1924, there was going to be an especially close approach of the two planets. And so even though by then Lowell was dead and his Martian civilization was looked at skeptically, still people thought, well, there could be a civilization there. And if at any time the Martians would want to try to reach us, it would be when the two planets came really close together, like this night in 1924. So one of Lowell's acolytes, named David Todd, who had been the head of the observatory at Amherst College in Massachusetts, but now actually was spending much of his time in insane asylums. He had some mental problems, but he still was able to convince the U.S. military. He spoke to the press. He said, if Mars is inhabited, this is going to be when they'll try to reach us. Now radio was a practical technology. We should silence our radios, not have any transmissions, and just listen. And so when Mars and Earth made that close approach, people listened. And some people heard some weird things. And David Todd, in fact, picked up, I don't have this in my book, but he was working with an early pioneer in television who had developed this device, sort of like a fax machine that would turn radio signals into a printout. And what it printed out, if you look at it sideways, looks sort of like a face. And David Todd believed this was the Martians showing us what they looked like.
Wow. Wow. Well, I got to ask, at the end of writing this book, what was your personal takeaway from all of this?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I went into the book thinking that I was writing a cautionary tale about how easy it is for us to fool ourselves into believing things just because we want them to be true. And that is certainly a lesson of the story. I mean, I'm not giving anything away to say there never was a civilization on Mars that we know of. Um, there certainly wasn't one at the turn of the last century, but it was a case of people over-interpreting data and then having greater confidence in their theories than they should have had. So that is something that we all have need to be aware of. We tend to blind ourselves into believing things that we want to be true, even if they're not true. But what surprised me was all the good that came out of that era. And as I already said, um, it was the Mars craze of the turn of the last century that inspired not only H.G. Wells, but Edgar Rice Burroughs, who's probably most famous for his Tarzan novels, but he wrote a whole series of best-selling books about Mars that just took off through the 20th century. And his books about Mars inspired people like Carl Sagan to go on and to become planetary scientists. And as I said before, it was the early rocket scientist, Robert H. Goddard, who's considered the father of American rocketry. He decided to try to invent a way to get to outer space because he read The War of the Worlds when he was a kid and thought, well, I wonder if you can travel between planets. Werner von Braun, the famous German rocket scientist who built rockets for the Nazis before he came to the US and built them for NASA. Similarly, he grew up on Mars fiction as a kid in Germany that was also exactly the same. It came right out of Percival Lowell's ideas about Mars. And so that fiction, that imagination is really important in terms of inspiring us to explore. So I do not fault Lowell for his theory. I don't fault him for the kind of the inspiration he had. He just wouldn't back down when the evidence came in that ran counter to his beliefs.
Mm. I found your book really did remind me of a line from Lewis where he says that reason is the organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning, and about how powerful it can be. He says, I think in Mere Christianity, he says how we like to think of ourselves as purely rational beings, but really we're much more complex than that. And seeing that interplay in the characters of your book, respected people, scientists, etc., but still that something caught their imagination that managed to blind them, and in some cases, permanently blind them to the evidence as it was accumulating. It's quite sobering.
Well, but I mean, what's great about science is, right, it's always pushing into new frontiers. And so
Mm-hmm.
when the first data come in, you don't know how to interpret them. And it does take imagination to think, well, how can I put these pieces together? And at that stage, imagination is critically important. But again, if we're talking about science and not science fiction, at some point, if the data start to suggest otherwise, you need to be ready to relent.
Mm.
That's my preaching at the moment.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It reminds me of Ransom when he steps out of the spacecraft on Malacandra and he doesn't actually know what he's looking at yet. He says you kind of got to know what you're looking at in order to be able to even see. Everything sort of playing catch up with him as his understanding is trying to wrap his head around what it is that he's actually encountering. Now, this final question is probably like asking a lady after she's leaving the maternity ward. So when are you going to have your next baby? What are you working on next?
Well, what I'm working on right now is resting. This book took me so much longer than I expected. It took me 7 years to write this book, and I mean that's because it just was a much richer tale than I expected, and there was a lot that had not yet been written. I mean, I relied on original source documents. I spent a lot of time in archives trying to decipher handwritten letters and diaries and that sort of thing, which I find great fun, but it's not fast. So before I launch into another book, I need to make sure it's going to be worth the effort, as I feel this one was. But I need to just recharge my batteries for a while. But I will say, this is now the second book I've written about the history of astronomy. And I really do enjoy writing both about history and astronomy. So I'm leaning toward finding another not so well known tale from at least the history of science and probably the history of astronomy. But it's going to mean finding the right story that's got great characters and a great setting and a fascinating plot that I'm going to want to spend years writing and that hopefully people will want to read.
Wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is The Martians by David Barron. David, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And viewers, please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.